At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, Jo Neal. And today, very sadly, I'm not accompanied by Dr. Hannah Thurger because she's not very well. So we wish her a very speedy recovery. But what I do want to tell you about Hannah is that she has completed the Brighton Marathon recently. So we're all extremely proud of her fantastic achievement at Drug Science. So today's podcast, everybody, very excited about this one. It's all about the LSD Microdot Gang in the 70s, but most specifically about Christine Bott, whose story has not been told sort of in full until today's guest self-published 2 books on the subject. And actually talking to our special guest today, she told me it's the first time that she's done an interview or a podcast with another woman. So that's great. And of course, telling a woman's story is so important, to all of us. So the guest is, if you haven't guessed already, is Catherine Hayes. And she is the author of The Untold Story of Christine Bott. And this is an autobiographical memoir after having been gifted Christine's memoirs. But there are 2 editions of this book. We've just been talking about that. And Catherine tells me that the new edition also contains information or the story of what happened to Christine in prison. So there are the 2 editions. And there is another book, so Catherine has been incredibly busy, called After Julie, the Kemp Tapes. And this is from interviews with Richard Kemp in 2022. So this is all about the LSD Microdot Gang based in Wales in the 1970s. Christine Bott and Richard Kemp were at the center of this LSD manufacturing or synthesis and distributing enterprise. And listeners might have heard about the police investigation Operation Julie, which led to their arrest in 1977, along with many other people. And it was the subject of an ITV documentary in 1985. They might indeed have listened to the story Acid Dream on BBC Sounds. That's still available, folks. That's very recent. Highly recommend that you listen to that. But more importantly, buy Catherine or Kate's books. So Kate was a friend of Christine Bott's, and she has focused on Christine's story. Christine was a trainee medic when she met Richard Kemp, who was a chemist. Very sadly, Christine died of cancer in 2007 after being released from prison in the 1980s. So I am going to say a very warm welcome to you, Kate. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I wondered if you'd like to start by kind of briefly summarizing the story of the sort of the Microdot Gang and Christine's role in this.
Thank you so much, Jo, and thanks for inviting me. And hello, everybody. It's great to do this and share more about Christine's story. So, yeah, the gang was really not a gang. It's bizarre. It's been dubbed a gang, but it was very much a kind of, Christine characterized it as a caper. She really quite liked being the outlaw, to be honest, because I think at the time it's really difficult to articulate the atmosphere of the 60s. It really is a case of if you weren't there, not that if you were there, not necessarily that you won't remember it because you were too stoned. The kind of things that were going on, there was a lot of activism. And I guess in the news recently, we've heard about the students occupying universities in America. And that is what was going on then. but in regards to the Vietnam War. So there was a lot of high feelings, a lot of sort of activism. There were a lot of concerns back then even about the environment and the whole civil rights movement, the Million Man March, the influence of Martin Luther King, the Kennedys getting shot, King getting shot. All of these things were sort of televised, and television was still sort of quite recent as an invention. So to try and capture that atmosphere, plus it's post-war, post-Second World War, Mum and Dad were kind of ruled the house, if you like. It wasn't, I think things have loosened up in this century, certainly at the end of the 20th century. Parents started to be more friendly towards children rather than admonishing them. But there was a huge generation gap post-war, I believe, and that caused sort of the ructions and the tensions where people were rebelling and doing things very, very differently. So you had things like the books, like David Cooper, Death of the Family, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
The writings by Paulo Freire, Hermann Hesse was a writer. Everybody was sort of just ingesting this way of trying to look at the world in a different way. You had R.D. Laing, you had all of the human growth and potential movement that was going on, where people were doing really wild things to try and break away from their conditioning. And Christine was right in the fulcrum of that time and believed, along with Richard and many others, that the answer to this urgent need to change the world was LSD, and that Richard's LSD, in fact, not any LSD. He managed to make what was considered to be 100% pure LSD, and because of the fact that it had become illegal and the original sort of place of LSD was California, and they'd all been locked up by this point, all of the chemists of that era. And when Richard came along, he was considered to be the person that could sort of fill that gap at the time. He was headhunted by a guy called David Solomon, who'd written a lot of books on LSD and on marijuana. And he was based in Cambridge. So he recruited Richard to make this LSD before he'd actually met Christine.
Was this part of Richard's PhD?
What, making LSD?
Well, maybe not making LSD, but I guess chemistry. He was clearly a very talented chemist.
That is what he was studying, yes, at Liverpool. And he was doing his PhD when he was recruited. And a chap called Ronald Stark came in, and he's the shadiest figure in this story. It's very unsure what his motives were, but he recruited Richard to go and work in Paris to make LSD. Originally, Solomon was interested in synthesizing cannabis.
Yeah, so the active ingredient of tetrahydrocannabinol, I think, wanted him to make that. Yeah. I gather that's pretty hard to make.
Yes, and this guy called Paul Arnaboldi, who was also a financier, came along and said, what are you doing that for? It grows everywhere. It has been growing everywhere for millennia. What you should be focusing on is LSD. So that's what they did. And Richard was taken to a laboratory in Paris to replace the person that apparently at the time they felt had gone out of control, one of the chemists called Sven, because it was a very dangerous process making LSD at that time. Not only did Richard sort of increase the potency of the LSD, but he also made it a lot safer. He found ways of synthesizing it that weren't as dangerous as when they'd been making it originally.
I wonder, when Albert Hofmann first synthesized it in 1938, I wonder, was that also a very dangerous process? I guess it probably was.
Yes. Now, I have no chemistry knowledge. After speaking to Richard, I felt like I had a PhD, but fortunately it went in one ear and out the other. So I've retained no informed knowledge about it, but there are the transcripts of our conversations. So, some of it is in After Julie, the Kemp tapes, but I've done my best to not do something that was going to criminalize me by sharing the recipe. So
Very sensible.
I've edited some of the details from that conversation because I think Richard really, even when I met him, 2 years ago, I think he still hankered to inform people about how he did it.
Yeah, well, I suppose it was such an achievement to make it so pure, in spite of sort of what happened. Yeah, I guess, that's kind of hard to forget or to leave behind, maybe.
I think for him, it was a moment where he believed he could help change and save, as he said, the human race. So the Microdot Gang, as it's called, was basically a group of individuals who didn't really know each other that well. Everything was done in a network which sort of stopped people from really having any connection to each other. And it was only at the point of arrest that Christine saw quite a few of the people who had been involved who she'd never met before.
That's really interesting, isn't it? But Christine, my understanding is that she wasn't interested in drugs. She was training to be a doctor. And it was only sort of through meeting Richard Kemp that she got, I guess, kind of introduced to high strength cannabis and then to LSD, and that her kind of, principle was always about the interconnectedness to nature. I heard in the podcast that she always took LSD outside in some,
Yeah, that was essential. What is interesting from having read about or got her writings about her early life is that she grew up with a sense of injustice. So when she met Richard and thought that this was a way to try and help change the world, that was the motivation. It wasn't to just be sort of drugged. It was to find a way to help people adjust their lifestyle in order to respond to a report that I only heard about in 2022, which was published in 1968 by a group of scientists called the Club of Rome.
Oh, I've never heard of that.
Neither had I. So the Club of Rome report was about the direction of society and the world, and that if we went in the direction we were going in, then we would be facing what we're living through now.
Oh, in terms of all the wars and the climate change. And
so this is what inspired Richard and Chris to do what they did, which is what the micro doctrine was about. The thing that Richard wrote whilst he was on remand, that he was going to use.
Wasn't he going to use that in court as his defense?
As mitigation. And his the guy that was the remand officer who he showed it to said the judge will see this as justification, not mitigation, and they'll throw away the key and they'll make it worse for your girlfriend as well. So that was enough for Richard to make the decision to not read it out in court. Chris didn't know that. She had believed that he'd been able to read it out.
Oh, that's interesting. Huh.
So when she went forward with her not guilty, it was based on, she knew that Richard was going to plead guilty because he was guilty of the crime that they were charging him with. However, she believed that as he was then, because he had, pleaded guilty and wasn't trying to avoid prison, that it would make it more plausible what he was saying. She was going to back it up by pleading not guilty, because why would she plead guilty to something where it was about her ethics and values? Because she'd not actually, in her mind, committed a crime. However, the evidence was put forward in such a way that she was accused of being the banker for the gang.
Oh, well, when they caught, did they arrest her in Switzerland, was it?
They found her in Switzerland when they followed her to Switzerland when she was taking some money, when they got some idea that David Solomon had been busted for cannabis in London, and they thought they'd better get rid of the money that they had. So each person had their own sort of bank account in different parts of, there was some in Switzerland, some in, I think there were a few different countries where the money was put. And so she agreed to take the money, was obviously followed. She then gave an explanation which actually was not the truth, but it could have been true, because it was true that I think it was her uncle was building a palace for the Sultan or something, and she was depositing money. And that was actually true. He was building a palace for the Sultan. But they used that one incident as evidence that she was the mastermind money person behind the whole thing. And this was literally the one thing she'd done to do with the money.
The one time that she did it.
Yeah. They were determined to throw the book at her, basically.
Did she ever practice as a doctor?
Sure, she qualified. She was a locum a lot of the time. Her sort of practice is documented slightly within her memoir. She had some time at a psychiatric hospital on placement. She was horrified to see the treatment, the electric shock treatment that was going on then. And she also saw a psychiatrist trying out LSD on a patient whilst they were strapped up to a machine. And she was absolutely horrified. He was measuring something in the patient's sort of breathing or something, and she was just, what on earth do they think they're doing? So that added to her sort of zeal about making it something that wasn't to do with treatment, but was to do with, I think the mistake she made, Jo, was that she believed that people would be as careful as she was with it.
Yes, and of course, once you've distributed, you've absolutely no control. And when we know how important it is, the set, your mindset when you take it, and who you're with, the setting, and you have no control over any of that once you've distributed it.
Yes, I think it's hard to put ourselves now into the world that they were in then, because although there were telephones and published news, that was about it. There was not the internet. There was not the speed of communication that we have now, where you can hear about something that's happening sort of the other side of the world within minutes of it happening.
Yeah, and see it on your phone, actually. You can see the video, can't you? I know, it's extraordinary, yeah.
So for her, I think because she was keeping her head down, she was doing an awful lot of hard labour on the small holding, or doing what she did as a doctor, the culture that she was feeding into didn't really come into her world. I think they created a very small world. So that was one thing that she did kind of regret, that she hadn't thought too much about how it was on the street. So when she ended up meeting me, that was a bit of a sort of wake-up call for her, because I was kind of the person that perhaps she hadn't given any time to think about, because there was 12 years between us in age. So
Sorry, how much between you?
12 years.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. So can you, I think our listeners would really like to know how you met and kind of how you became such good friends.
Yes, so I decided to train to be a person-centered therapist in 1994. I went along to the University of East Anglia and I was offered a place. And when you do a course like that, then the first week was an intensive week where everybody sits around and tells their story. They kind of tell their autobiography, the things that they want you to know. So when I went to that, Christine was one of the participants, and one of the things she said was that she'd been imprisoned for conspiracy to flood the world with LSD.
Not what you'd expect somebody to tell you.
Which was quite an opener, really.
Yeah.
And for me, I had heard of Operation Julie, but it kind of put her in a frame where I thought we're meant to have met, where this was meant. And it also flagged her up as an alternative person, which is clearly what I was, as in, someone who liked to sort of eat organic food or look after the planet, the kind of sort of non-conventional lifestyle. And out of the 19 participants in that year, we were the two whose stories we could relate to the enormity of the other story. So Christine had been in prison. I had been traded for LSD as a runaway 17-year-old.
Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
So I was all whipped up by the sort of the feelings of the time. I was living in outer London. I used to hitch into London to see all of the music there. Was very influenced by the psychedelic scene. I had been the youngest of 4, so with 3 brothers. They were all into the alternative scene. My parents were quite sort of conventional. They were Catholic. My dad was a Canadian. He'd come over during the Second World War. He'd met my mum, who was from Durham, from a mining family. She was a nurse and had met my father when he was recovering from an illness he got whilst fighting in Italy. So, and they tried to live in Canada. They tried to live there. It hadn't worked out. And they tried twice, in fact, before I was born. When they came back to England the second time I was born. So there was this kind of quite sort of huge generation gaps going on there. My dad used to have to catch a horse to go to school.
Wow. Amazing.
And now here we were, living in the outskirts of London, and he was a taxi driver. So the culture clash was really massive.
Yeah.
And I think although their lives had been really challenging and exciting, they just wanted us to be conventional children. And none of us were. We were all rebels.
Well, as a parent, the more they wanted you to be conventional, I'm sure the less you were conventional,
I do understand more with time. You sort of look back and you think, oh, Lord, poor them.
Yeah, I agree.
But it was also of the era. So we were just caught up in this rather extraordinary time. So one of my brothers had a theatre, ran a street theatre company. Another brother was an artist. Another brother was an organic gardener. We were all dropping out and doing our own thing. And when they all grew up and got married, I was the last one left. And unfortunately, I think my parents really tried to, control me. And rather than talk and listen and be interested in me, they wanted to, use other methods, if you like.
Yeah.
And I ended up running away and with a friend, and then didn't naively, a bit like Christine, really. She had her own naivety. I had my own naivety. Because I'd had 3 brothers, I never believed I was any different to a boy. They never made me feel less than them. And my parents never made me feel unequal as a girl. So when I went out into the wide world and discovered that wasn't true, that was in itself a learning curve at the
Especially
time.
at that time.
Yeah. So I put myself into peril without knowing. I thought I was running towards freedom, and actually I was running towards possible death. I escaped with my life more than once. and ended up on the hippie trail to Morocco with a man who was not a good person. I was 17. I'm not sure how old he was. He was definitely in his mid-20s, and he was not a kind person. He had a puppy who I used to have to carry because if I didn't, he'd kick it. That's the
Oh,
kind of person he was. Yeah,
really?
lovely little dog. Anyway, yeah, I ended up in dire straits, and at the border at Morocco, they decided to let me go. So one of the guys that we'd hitched a lift with didn't want to go through because at the time in Morocco, if your hair was long and you were male, you had to have it cut
Oh, wow.
or you wouldn't go through because there were so many hippies going through.
Yeah.
That was one way of trying to control it. And one German guy, Footy, his hair was sort of chin length and he was okay. The guy I was with, the English guy, Dave, his hair was shoulder length. So on the border, I had to cut his hair.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
The other German guy who was giving the lift, they were smugglers. His hair was down to his back, the top of his back, and he wasn't going to cut his hair. So he agreed to stay with me, but Dave gave them this bag of acid to get rid of me to them.
How charming. I mean, but as you say, you were traded for LSD that perhaps came from the Microdot Gang.
Yeah. It was afterwards that I realized it took a long time, actually. It took a long time to make sense of it in my head. And it was only when someone who's no longer alive, sadly, an Australian psychotherapist called Bernie Neville, he was talking about trafficked girls that he used to look after. And I thought, that's what happened to me. And it wasn't until I was in my late 50s that I twigged that,
Gosh. Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
Because when Footy came back with all of the cannabis that they were going to smuggle, he couldn't get rid of me quick enough. He chucked me out of the car on the roadside and just drove off. And I had no money. I had my passport, but yeah. So that was a heartbreak. And then on top of the heartbreak, I got picked up by a bad actor who was going to he said he'd take me to the airport, but he didn't. He took me to a disused roadway, which was being built for a motorway, and raped me. And I just about survived. I don't know why he didn't kill me, because he was strangling me, but he stopped.
Unbelievable. That's gruesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard story. It was a long time ago, but it was. I hear women talking about being raped they started to do this more often in the last 10 years. You hear old women, and I'm an old woman now, talking about these things and how much it impacted on their life. And you think, oh God, that could have been me, and it has affected me, but not to the degree that perhaps it affected some women where, the shame sort of is impossible to shrug off. I haven't shrugged anything off, but I have also not felt guilt about it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of women end up feeling some form of guilt.
Yeah. No, absolutely. What a terrible, terrible, thing to
It
happen.
doesn't get any better though.
Yeah.
It got worse.
Yeah. I guess there was no support either. There wasn't so much support in those days.
Well, I was just fortunate that when I broke down after it happened, this kid sort of decided to help me and managed to help me get in touch with the Canadian embassy at the time, because I had a Canadian passport on me. It was the only passport I had. And I got flown back to England. But when I got back to England, it was such a relief to be back that I didn't really have the chance. I went to see a doctor who examined me, but Yeah, there was a lot going on that was really hard. It's really hard still, really, to actually talk about on air. But then I ended up going to Polytechnic in Cambridge, and I was basically traumatized. And there was, at the time, I don't know if people remember, but there was the Cambridge rapist was in the news, and I was living on my own in student digs, and someone came to see. Cambridge was very strange at the time, and because I was on my own, I was still very young and quite pretty. I attracted a lot of attention, and the drug scene then was just very weird, you know.
Terrifying.
Yeah, it was just very weird, and I ended up with a lot of cannabis. People just kept on giving me cannabis, and that then put me into a psychotic state. And it was after that that then I ended up being committed into a mental hospital, which was for adults. And before I even slept, I was given electric shock treatment. Before I was even talked to, I was just manhandled, injected with a knockout drug. And then when I woke up, my head hurt, and they'd administered electric shock treatment.
Gracious.
I had no talking therapy.
That's shocking, isn't it? No, therapy offered or support or all the things that, because you must have had severe PTSD.
Well, I don't think that they even had that as a diagnosis. I was in an altered state. I think the human being is extraordinary in how resourceful it is in its ways of trying to protect the individual from harm. However, I think how you're approached and, if you like, worked with is crucial. And I was just being observed rather than interacted with.
I have to say, psychiatry is a lot better these days.
I can't say. I think there's a lot of places where a lot of drugs are being administered to a lot of young people who are basically just being managed. I'm sorry, Joe, but
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, I mean, that kind of brings me on to the psychedelic renaissance. And I wondered what your view of that was. All the trials going on now on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, for severe depression, for addiction, and really managing severe mental illness in a totally different way. So, this would be a complete paradigm shift in how we manage mental illness, how we treat it, and actually help people to recover and be healed.
yeah. I guess I've got a kind of social construct approach to emotional distress. I'm not part of an illness model. My approach that I chose to train in was very much not an illness model, and was one that Christine also, that's how we met, was the person-centered approach, which does not consider what people experience as an illness, more as a sort of reaction to intolerable lives,
Yeah, to trauma.
to trauma, to prejudice, to
Yeah,
racism, to sexism,
sexism. Yeah, yeah, all
to
that.
inequality, to poverty. I think that by framing emotional distress as an illness does a disservice to human beings, and I think can limit the hope of how someone might find a way through. I think Finland's been interesting in how they have managed their mental health services. There's so many alternatives, but in this country, it's very hard to get a platform for it because everything's medicalized. And, you know, for me, I don't know what Chris would make of it either.
Yeah, I was really interested in what you think, because having had, the ethos of LSD for interconnectedness, connected to each other, to nature, I wonder how she would feel kind of about the psychedelic renaissance, because a lot of it is about that really now. So we've kind of come full circle.
Well, it's kind of been sort of, it's at risk of being commodified, I think, and incorporated. For her, it was a way of sort of revolutionary, changing the world, not changing an individual's reaction to trauma. However, they also, both her and Richard, both felt that the only way to change the world was for the individual to change. But if it's done I just think there's so many tricky things, and I'm not qualified to know because I haven't chosen to train in working with psychedelics. I think the power imbalance would be something that mattered. I think ideally any of it would be done not in a clinic. And if you think of the roots of any of this stuff, it's traditions going back to ancient tribal practices and something that's to be a spiritual awakening or a spiritual journeying rather than a treatment. I listened to Gabor Mate,
Oh, he's phenomenal.
and the few things I watched him talk about was his summation was basically it's you need to do group work. You need to work. People need to work in groups. He seemed to accept that the psychedelic work was useful and his own experiences were useful, but essentially it's about interrelations with people being able to find ways of being themselves with each other, and that's the whole thesis of the person-centered approach as well. So it's a sort of completely different approach to how to respond to trauma, as you've said. And I think a lot of the sort of psychotherapeutic communities, a colleague of mine at Nottingham was very much behind the sort of group therapy and in communities where people were together. And I think one of the things that I hope might be thought about again, especially as people are confronting so many problems with accommodation and with sort of finding their feet and getting their roots, is to look at alternative ways of living, is to look at living communally and finding ways of being with each other that are open and honest. It's hard though. It's hard work. It's not an easy life, and that might be the difficulty. But some people feel that, this renaissance, if you like, is a chance to try again at some of the ideas that were around at the time without the panic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, without the panic, without the huge kind of fear and stigma that has sort of risen up about psychedelics.
Well, it was the establishment was under threat in
Yeah.
the 60s and 70s, and this is why I think they focused so much on Operation Julie. They didn't do the same with heroin. They didn't do the same with amphetamines, because those things weren't disrupting the roots of society.
Yeah, they haven't been stigmatized in nearly the same way, I don't think.
Certainly not sort of to the degree that LSD was. And if you think of it, it was something that you might take once.
Yes.
It's not addictive. It's not something that actually needs to be done again. And I'm not someone that wants to advocate for LSD as it was back then, but just to try and communicate the ideas around it of how to change, how to make the world a better place. How do we change society? How do we make people less prone to anxiety, depression, trauma? How do we treat each other properly? And I think, one of the things that came out in the 60s was sexual liberation. Certainly that was skewed that the pill basically left men able to go ahead with their own proclivities, and some women, and, towards each other. I'm not saying that anyone's squeaky clean in this, but then it became something that pornographers jumped on. And we've now got that whole problem of, children being exposed to things that they're not ready for.
Oh no, that's terrifying. Yeah.
We have made an absolute mess, but I think there are ways of changing that and understanding it and rewriting it and encouraging people to, take heart and to be hopeful, not only with the environment, but with human relations with each other. I think it's essential. And I guess this is why I've self-published Christine's story, because I know she felt the same. And to try and get that message over, rather than the one where, the clever coppers came in and busted these very bad people who actually weren't wicked people. They were really originally very, very keen to help change the direction of society.
And it's kind of hard not to have sympathy for their ideals and what they wanted to achieve. And as you say, it's something that we badly need now, the connectedness to nature. The planet is on fire, connectedness to each other, social sort of structure. People are very lonely the way we live now. That's we really need to change things for the better. And the desire to do that is probably in so many of us.
Yes, and I think, you can't kill an idea. I think people love the music of the era,
Yeah.
but it's also connecting to the ideas behind the music and the hope of it. And I think humans are amazing. I think human potential is vast. And I think through doing the hard work, if you like, of taking the chance to be visible and to be yourself to others, I think there's more openness to that kind of dialogue and communication than ever. And certainly with podcasts, you can hear all sorts of stories. And I think for people to know that their story matters is also important. So I'm sorry I haven't got much insight or view on using psychedelics. I've heard from people that it has changed their lives. I've heard from people who've said that microdosing has changed their lives. So I certainly would not speak against that as something that's a kind of helping people to live a more comfortable life. But I think we need to actually get under that and find ways of restructuring society in such a way where war isn't the answer.
Absolutely. Yeah. As you say, Christine came about this from a social justice perspective, which is where we all need to be, really.
Well, I'm glad you feel the same, because I think it can feel overwhelming, I think, to look at, and I think this is part of the problem as well, is that people are getting so many sort of strange messages, I think, through the internet. I think sort of schooling is something that has stopped being an adventure and just become something that, people are already customers as school children. And I remember being able to teach lessons when I was actually qualified. I was declared normal in order to become a teacher. It's hilarious. I don't know how many people have been declared normal. I've been declared normal twice.
I don't think I've ever been declared normal.
Yep.
That's great.
But you used to be able to sort of, I don't know, pick a subject as you were going into work and to explore it with the children and come out with some amazing things. I do feel sorry for teachers. It's less of, I remember all of these files, my great nieces and great nephews amassing files now by the time they're 6 of their milestones. It's like, what's wrong with just muddling through?
That's right. And education, learning should be an adventure and exciting. And it's so sad if we're taking that out of it, and learning by play, and
And
yeah,
what they
yeah,
did to art, I mean, I was qualified to be an art teacher at Goldsmiths College, and when I realised that I was meant to be sort of instructing what came out of their pencils, I realised that art as a subject was no longer for me. And so when I found the work of Carl Rogers, where essentially you follow the client leads everything, you alongside them as they explore and unfold things. Certainly in the addiction field, it feels now such a luxury, but I worked in addictions for about 9-10 years, and it was self-referral, and there was no limit on the sessions.
so you could have as many sessions as you wanted.
Free.
That was really, really great.
That was in the late 90s, going up towards early 28, 7, 8. Yeah, those services have just been slashed. But I found ways of managing my caseload. So there were some people who only needed 4 sessions, and then there'd be others
Really?
who had 36. I think people forget that actually when you go to see a therapist, you don't necessarily want to tell them all of your, it can be quite hard. So if someone, finds that they get somewhere, they're not going to invent something so that they can come back and see you again, because it's not like you're the mate or anything. They've got their lives to live, and if they can go off and live them in a better way. And I think there's this sort of approach to the human being which is suspicious. Oh, people are going to take advantage. All of that stance is really destructive, and it's certainly not what I've experienced. I think now, looking back, 30 years experience as a therapist, I cannot remember any client I had where I felt that they were just exploiting my time. Never.
No, I
And
can't.
it's just very sad that, that seems, the suspicion of people.
Yeah. Did Christine ever practice as a psychotherapist?
She couldn't. No, she couldn't. She ended up going to America, where she had to be undercover because having a record, she couldn't sort of be visible. She was trying to get onto courses and study and get legitimate through her marriage, but none of that came to anything.
And she did get back together with Richard Kemp, didn't she, after they got released from prison?
They got back together, yes. She had a house. He moved to the house. And after a couple of years, she realised that he was going to try and do it all over again, and she couldn't believe
Oh my
that
word.
he would risk her freedom again. So she left him.
Gosh, that's incredible. And when you met Richard, did he talk about that? I know he was very grateful to you, for writing these books and her memoirs.
Yes, it was very hard to help Richard articulate anything on an emotional level. He was very keen to talk scientifically and quite keen to talk about, the bad boy stuff, the blokey stuff.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah.
But when it came to trying to get any insight on his feelings for Christine, it would eventually break out. And he, because I didn't know, I had believed, having known Chris and knowing how little she talked about Richard, but when she did, she would sort of shake.
Oh.
And I thought that this was heartbreak,
Yeah.
And actually, I realised it was probably fury.
Oh.
Because he was willing to go down that route again, risk her freedom. And it was Richard who told me. And he, and I said, so she couldn't believe that you were going to do this and again. And he said she couldn't believe that I was so bloody minded that I was going to go on and try and do it again, and she buggered off, She just left me. And I think that broke his heart a bit too, actually, because he thought that they were forever. He did believe that they were forever.
Yeah.
But he then subsequently had, the relationship he had with Christine was one of the shortest relationships, even though that was 9 years or so, maybe 11. He then went on, he got married to a woman who he was with for about 15 years. And then there was a woman in Spain that he was with for 20 years.
Oh.
So, yeah.
So she, obviously they all got arrested and put in prison, and she had a really terrible time in prison, I think.
Well, yeah. She was sent to H Wing, which was a wing in Durham Jail, which was a male prison.
Extraordinary.
Yes. And it was a wing of the prison that was deemed unsuitable for men. So they put women in it.
How very odd.
And it was for the 36 most dangerous women in the country. So it meant that she was in there with Myra Hindley.
Good gracious.
With a few other murderers.
How did they come to that conclusion about her?
Well, I think, Joe, some of the writing about Operation Julie wishes to make links between what they were doing with the LSD to terrorism.
Seems bit far-fetched.
But it stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the accounts of her going to Bristol Crown Court shows that her vehicle, or the vehicles that had the prisoners in, were surrounded by armed police. They had snipers on the surrounding buildings. So they would, because they believed that there was still a lot of LSD and also a lot of money, they treated them as though they would be busted out, like bank robbers or...
Yeah.
So they had that level of security. Also, during the court, the judge pronounced that none of the press could report on the backstory of any of the witnesses. Now, originally I thought that was to prevent Christine and Richard's story being heard, but I think it was also to protect the undercover police. And I think that's also why the actual records of the court case is under a D notice until for 70 years. So it won't be the actual records of the case, if they still exist, in fact, won't be released.
But it's so great that you've been able to tell the story.
Well, certainly it was only Christine who, entrusted me with her story. I don't think this would have ever been known. And certainly, I think because they literally put their heart and soul into it, the heartbreak afterwards was so great, and the kind of vilification that had happened meant that they went into secret. And certainly Richard wouldn't trust anybody, so he's been sought after ever since he was in prison to talk and tell his story, and he's refused point blank because he wouldn't trust how it would be characterized or how it would be framed. So it wasn't until he heard about Christine's story and talked to me that he was willing to be heard after 45 years of silence. So that in itself was quite mind-blowing for me.
Mind-blowing for everybody that
I
you've
guess.
been able to do this.
Yeah, a bit.
But you had such a lovely friendship with Christine.
Yeah, I miss her hugely still. I mean, it's been something to do this. It's felt like a real responsibility, but also a massive privilege. But everybody who met her was so impressed by her character, her integrity, her wish to encourage others in everything that they did. her belief in the potential of human beings, her love of nature, her love of animals.
Yeah, there's a great story about the goats. Didn't they become goat breeders or sheep rearers? And when they came to arrest her, she wouldn't go with the police until she'd milked one of the goats.
Yeah. Yeah, and this was one of her main things when she was locked up. She needed them to let her know what had happened to the goats, that it couldn't just be any bod, that it needed to be someone who knew what they were doing. And then and then one of her visitors came to see her with a sandwich, which was Stella, basically.
Oh, good
I
grief.
know. A friend of mine heard that bit of the story or read that bit of the story, and he said he was a vegan and he couldn't read anymore. He was so furious.
Terrible. That's a horrible, horrible thing. Because, that sort of selflessness, that was her main worry, was all these goats that she'd reared. And what would happen to them? Not what would happen to her, but what was going to happen to them. I thought that kind of really showed what a person she was.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, she wasn't a vegetarian. She did eat meat, but only a bit like, I have family who are involved in that kind of thing, but they'll grow, it'd be organic. It'd be, so, and not that often. And I think that's certainly true for Christine. She wasn't a carnivore as such, as an omnivore, but yes, so all of these different movements and sort of philosophies, they've got to come back to a basic sense of love for the planet and for the things that you're caring for and the plants that you're growing. She got very much into energies. There was an awful lot of stuff going around about vibrations and the energetic vibration of plants and, the whole philosophy of spiritual life, different levels of spiritual existence. She was very interested in all of that. She was a spiritual practitioner in herself. She devised her own way of being. I don't think she ever followed a particular doctrine, but she did develop her own spiritual practice. And that's in the second book, actually. I've written out her way of sort of being in the world, the stuff she's described about how she let go of certain things, working with the 4 directions or 6 directions, which was interestingly very similar to the kind of stuff I did with Joseph Ryle, a guy called Joseph Ryle, who's known as Beautiful Painted Arrows, a Pueblo Picaros Indian, who brought an awful lot of teachings to England from Mexico and certainly helped me in my life. I think sometimes with trauma, a person doesn't cut it. It has to be. I remember feeling met once by a cave.
Oh,
Sitting by a cave.
yeah.
And just that sense of ancient sort of energy from the depths of the earth met something in me that made me feel held.
Yeah. That's
like
lovely.
working, with nature, with trees, with the ocean. These things, we're part of them. And if we choose to connect into them, then they will help us.
Yeah, which is exactly kind of what Albert Hoffman said about LSD, and people, psychedelic practitioners, indigenous people. That's exactly what their ethos is.
Well, I really hope that there's a good future with it. And I understand from hearing David Nutt recently on the radio because there's been quite a lot talked about.
Yeah, he was on last week, in fact. Yeah.
The interviewer was saying about, big pharma being something that would come in and ruin it. And David Nutt saying, well, actually, then they're not.
No.
They're not going to be involved. So I think that's probably a good thing. But it will mean, though, that it's down to people pioneering, I suppose, and finding their ways of being with it. But yeah, I think it's a complicated situation. But if it's going to bring help to people, if it's going to, relieve people, then that's, a good thing. And I think much better than the SSRIs or all of the stuff that's out there now that's just numbing people.
Certainly doesn't heal people, does it? The way that psychedelics seem to do.
Yeah, that's the word you used earlier about healing, and that's interesting actually, because it's not what SSRIs do. Yeah.
No. And to have something that you take a couple of times. As you say, people don't take them often. The Global Drug Survey showed that people 2 or 3 times a year for their own sort of practice. Yeah, that's a complete paradigm shift for psychiatry. This has been, we're just about running out of time. Kate, such a shame. I could talk to you all evening. This is absolutely lovely. So 2 books, well, 3 books, but The Untold Story, 2 editions.
Well, I've sort of stopped producing the first one because it's in the second one. So it's just 2 books really. But thanks for.
So for our listeners then, I know you have your own website, so that's where they can purchase the books. Can they get them on Amazon or?
No, 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 they can't.
Good to know. So from your website, and have you got plans to do any? I mean, you've done an awful lot. It's been such a vast amount of work and so important to get this story out there. Have you got any plans for any more books?
Well, I have promised that I would write my own story. It's been there in various forms for about 20 years. So I'm trying to find the right way of telling it. So that would be, if I was going to write anything else, that would be the next thing to complete it. I mean, it's all there. It's just finding, I don't know, Joe, when you know a lot about your own self, it's like, well, why would people want to know? It's just, but I think there's enough in there to sort of.
For sure. But listening to your account of what happened to you on Acid Dream, it's all part of the same story in a way, I think. So I do think it would be a fantastic book.
Well, thank you so much. It's been so lovely to talk to you, and I hope I haven't rambled on too much.
Not at all. No, it's been our privilege. It's been absolutely fantastic. So thank you, Kate Hayes, everybody, again. You've mentioned quite a lot of sort of publications, the Club of Rome report. If we can find that, we'll put those on the show notes. So listeners, you have mentioned quite a lot of literature. Fantastic. So thank you very much indeed, Kate.
Thank you, Joe.